Welcome to the program. Fulton Armstrong is back. You might remember he spent 2 episodes with us in Season 2 discussing Latin American foreign policy issues and concerns and geopolitics and the United States' role in that part of the world. We covered a wide variety of other topics, but it was so in-depth, it was so thorough, we made 2 episodes out of it, and it was popular. And so by popular demand, Fulton Armstrong is back. But this time we're talking about democracy in a more intellectual sense and in a more philosophical sense. So in today's conversation, we're going to be using terms like liberal and illiberal democracies. We'll define those at the outset, but just to give you an initial sense of what we're thinking about, these are nations where elections take place, but the principles of liberal democracy, like civil liberties, judicial independence, freedom of expression, whether through the press or through individual protest, are steadily eroded. It's a topic that those of you who listen to this program have certainly read about, you have heard about. So I thought it was very important for us to discuss it and to challenge somebody who has some experience with seeing these sorts of governments, especially in Latin America, with both the cases that have been made around the world for this form of democracy and, of course, the threats that it brings. We want to explore what this shift in public consciousness towards populism and illiberalism might mean for the global order and how democratic societies can respond to it. So for those who were not with us in Season 2, who need a reintroduction, Fulton Armstrong is a veteran intelligence analyst and policy advisor whose 3-decade government career ranged from National Intelligence Officer for Latin America to Senior Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the U.S. National Security Council, as well as being a senior staff member of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Today, in addition to serving as a senior fellow at American University, he's an adjunct professor with Syracuse University's Maxwell School in Washington, D.C. There, he designs and teaches graduate courses on intelligence, foreign policy decision-making, and Latin American affairs. He leads immersive site visits to the Pentagon and foreign embassies and mentors Maxwell students as they transition from the classroom to professional roles in government and international organizations. His dual academic and practitioner perspective gives him a unique lens on how illiberal democracies emerge and how policymakers and future public service leaders can respond. Today, we are going to dive into the origins, the mechanisms, the implications of this concept of illiberal governance, using Hungary as an example because Viktor Orbán, their prime minister, their president, their leader, has been so open about discussing it as his preferred form of government, to places like El Salvador and Nicaragua, for that matter, and examine how these regimes maintain control while retaining at least the facade of democratic legitimacy. Stay tuned to the end of the program where I'll give you a couple of parting thoughts on this topic. But in the meantime, it's my honor to present for Season 3's conversation with Fulton Armstrong. Fulton, welcome back to the program.
Delighted to be here. Thanks very much, Brian.
All right, so we're going to use some terminology throughout the course of the show here that could mean different things to different people, so I want to get us started with some solid definitions and understanding. We're going to talk a lot about the concept, been thrown around a lot in intellectual and academic circles, of illiberal democracies and also liberal democracies. So I'd love for you to give us your interpretation of those terms as we talk about this topic today.
Very good. Let's start with the definition, at least what I use in my analysis and have used throughout my career in my analysis, definition of liberal democracy. And then we can easily say that illiberal democracy is something that moves away from it, and there are many different phases of it. Liberal democracy is what you and I grew up believing, that we had a system almost perfected with human rights, civil rights, freedom of the press, our sacred First Amendment rights, as well as all of the various amendments, the rights to protection from illicit searches, from accusations, the right to vote, all of these things, plus, very importantly, the institutions that created the checks and balances to make this liberal democracy work, including, if you will, allow me to be a little bit liberal in my use of words, even the occasional rebellion that Thomas Jefferson had spoken of, that all systems require some rebellion. In other words, require some change, require that the checks and balances every once in a while, instead of just going nice and slow and actually not changing for long periods of time, suddenly click and we have more significant reforms, more significant changes. The problem is who's going to benefit from these, quote, rebellions at the end. I believe, and I'm not a historian, I'm not a profoundly deep thinker of what the founders had meant, but I think that what Jefferson and Ben Franklin said similar things. A lot of the founders were thinking the same thing, is that we need protection of the people from the elites, especially the moneyed elites, the people, I'm not talking about cultural elites and artists and things. I'm talking about the people who have real power that comes often from wealth. And that you need to have these protections, these checks and balances, which in a liberal democracy, which we saw functioning quite well here in the United States, with some real problems that we were addressing over the years. But it was this idea of checks and balances with strong institutions, with a strong fourth estate, the strong, free, independent media, with then the concurring values of accountability and transparency, that we were basically able to govern ourselves as a people with these checks and balances to keep somebody from getting too much power and serving too small a constituency. So that's the definition that I use, reminding you of my emphasis on the word institutions. Illiberal democracy are ones that have elements of liberal democracies, but when you add them all up, do not really protect the rights, do not protect the liberties, if you will, that we all need for these systems to be working. So we could find in Eastern Europe, we have some very good examples. In much of the region where I spent a lot of my career in Latin America, the democracies have not been in a stable form liberal democracies. So, illiberal democracy, one could say a more extreme form of it would be the autocratic regimes, authoritarian regimes, where very few elements, maybe an occasional election with maybe only one candidate, uh, and elements like that remain. There's one word that we also probably, Brian, should agree on, and that is the word populism. Populism is a word that people use usually in a derogatory form. I use it primarily in a derogatory form. And populism is a kind of democracy that's direct to the point of circumventing institutions, circumventing checks and balances. But whether it's populism of the left or populism of the right, the idea is that the governors are going to have such incredible power that they're going to tell the governed what's going on, even though they pretend to be listening to the governed. And what they're doing is they're listening to constituencies, many of which they themselves have created, and responding to them. Oh, my base wants me to do this, so I shall do it. That's my sort of populism. So those definitions are the ones that I think that you and I could use for this conversation.
Okay, so that gets us off to a good start and a good understanding of these terms that we're going to use throughout the conversation today. So, probably the most notable international figure who has thrown around openly the term of illiberal democracy is Hungary's Viktor Orbán, who has been unabashed in suggesting that in order to bring about the kind of culture, society reforms that he wants for his country and his people, that it is inconsistent with the values of liberal democracies, and he has won elections on largely this grounds. Now, current situation aside, there's obviously opposition candidates, opposition parties. You never know what's going to happen just around the corner. But let's just take that as an example of a world leader who stated it, said it out loud, really suggested that they're going to go in that direction. And they've to date had the population of a democracy behind them enough to win elections consistently. What is fueling this and why now?
What's fueling it, I believe, is a series of ambitions. The ambitions of course, the individual who has embodied this model and boasted about his leadership as an illiberal president. But also, we have to remember, whether we're talking about Viktor Orban or here in our own hemisphere, we have Bukele, President Bukele of El Salvador, who calls himself the coolest dictator. He uses the word himself, dictator, flaunting the values of liberal democracy by using the exact opposite, dictator, and claiming also that he has the support of the people. And the polls show that he does have the support of the people. I think that one of the main drivers, of course, is the ambition of these individuals. But whether you look at those two, who are very, very clear examples, or the others that are nudging more and more away from liberal democracy with all of the institutional trappings that we talked about before, what we see is they're really not the creators of the phenomenon, the creators of this push. They're more a symptom of it, or let's say they're also the opportunists who harness it, take advantage of it. One image that I have in my mind, not that these are all circus acts, is a circus act in which you have, the jalopy full, the little miniature car full of clowns, but one clown out on the dirt running around in front of the car. And he's the star of the show. The clown that's being chased is actually the star of the show, not the clowns in the jalopy. But it's quite interesting that the guy the clown who is running up in front is looking over his shoulder because he wants to continue being there out front. He doesn't want the car to stop chasing him. So they create this idea, this show, that there's this phenomenon that's pushing them to do it, but that they're also simultaneously driving it. And I think that's a really important point when we look at Orbán, when we look at Bukele, and when we look at even some phenomena, be careful with my words here, that we're seeing in the United States. We have someone in all of these situations, and in Latin America, there are more examples than not of them, people who are claiming to be leading, but are actually following movements that they very cynically have tapped into and nurtured and fed. And those underlying movements are what we in the analytical world find more interesting than just a Viktor Orbán or a Bukele in El Salvador. Because the drivers of those movements, they've identified them perhaps at a nascent stage, but they have fed them, they have encouraged them, and they have given legitimacy to them so that they then do become true drivers of where the system is going to head.
So let's ask the controversial question, which is, do these leaders have a point? And I ask that in this context. There are those, mainly in the current global environment, from a right wing perspective, who believe that their version of society, culture, economics, international affairs, that to achieve that, it is very difficult to do it within the traditional liberal democracy institutional construct, because there will be a free press that pushes against it. There will be an academic community that pushes against it. There'll be a court system. And they're not wrong about that. So, do you believe that the vision of the world that a leader like an Orbán or a Bukele or leaders in the U.S. and others, that to give us the kind of world that they and their voters want, you have to have a degradation of those institutions to achieve it?
That's a really good phrasing of the question. They create a problem, they fuel a problem, including, for example, undermining. I think you had a great shopping list here of what we need to be looking for the health of a society: press, universities, dynamics in Congress, courts, and all of that. But if you're the one who is weakening those organizations, those very valuable checks and balances, then it is a little bit cynical of you to say, well, because all of these institutions are so weak, you need a strong leader like me. The fact is that the immediate question that you would be asking on this beautiful afternoon during our conversation here is that isn't strongman leadership more effective? The immediate answer for right now is yes, we do need strong leadership, and sometimes in certain circumstances it has to be strong leadership. But in broader terms, in evolutionary terms, and especially as we find our way toward improving our democracies rather than dismantling them, you have to go and look at the other underlying drivers. The underlying drivers are, yes, there are problems. When has the world not had problems, Brian? We always have problems, but we've always had processes to look to first do analysis of those problems, and from that analysis pull out options, and from those options, through political debate, discourse, transparency, etc., we find a way of deciding which way to go. But if you have sabotaged the information, you have sabotaged the debate, and you sabotage the options. You're creating a problem that's not necessary. I'll just start with one thing. The seed of a lot of this are perceptions that democracy doesn't work. Perceptions, for example, that, oh, we poor Americans who benefited massively from globalization, oh, we poor Americans are the victims of globalization. It's a false perception, but the perception is out there. These perceptions do need to be addressed, but they have to be addressed with information rather than with manipulation. And so if you don't deal with information, and I'm not saying this with any partisan agenda, because I could do a dissertation for you, Brian, the huge lost opportunities of even during the Obama era, huge lost opportunities, and even bigger lost opportunities during the Biden administration. And I say that with a certain amount of admiration for both men and having seen both of them functioning when I was working in the United States Senate and stuff. So this isn't a partisan statement, but we have not done well at letting people understand these things that you're miserable about. They have causes, they also have solutions. Globalization, for example, we are the cause of globalization. We benefited from it. We're the ones that set the rules. We're the ones whose formerly manufacturing class, the wealthy entrepreneurial class, moved our production capabilities and our jobs over to China. We're the ones that turned a blind eye to the pending problems and the looming train wreck. None of these train wrecks was completely is any surprise, to tell you the truth. And we're the ones who have done it. Now what we have to do is, instead of just going with the strong man and following sometimes wacky solutions by breaking the systems and all of that, we need to start finding solutions in a serious way based on sound analysis. Right now, what we have in some places, we have a leader who presents himself almost as the Messiah, who walks into the temple and is shocked that in the temple there's commerce going on, and then undertakes, because they're not controlling all of that commerce, to go and knock over all of the tables and all. And it's ludicrous. They're not messiahs. Often they actually have created a lot of these problems, and knocking over everybody else's table while protecting yours is not a solution. In democracy, whether you call it liberal or illiberal, that neither one of them fall within the word democracy.
Well, one of the things that seems to be most attractive to people who are observers rather than living in the system, and let's use Latin America as an example, let's use El Salvador as our example, is the perception that though distasteful, some of the actions that a president like Bukele has taken, there is a belief that it's been highly effective, and therefore perhaps the ends justify the means. As
That
an analyst, how do you view that, and how would you counter that very attractive argument that this is what it took to instill law and order in a place that seemed beyond reach for it?
That's a valid question. And for some people in El Salvador, the ends have justified the means for some. For many others, however, they say, wait a second, we're not a police state. We don't take 80,000, 90,000 people, many of whom are innocent, whose only crime is to have tattoos that somebody claims represent a particular gang or something. That's not what we're really all about, especially if we're not going to give them habeas corpus, we're not going to give them a trial. Oh, and also, we're also going to have a president that violates the Constitution and maneuvers the constitutional courts into letting him run for a second term. One thing after another. Your solution looks good in the very short term. But as many people who see, yes, let's get the bad guys off the street, are saying, hey, but you're taking my friend's son, you're taking innocent people, and where are the democratic human rights and civil rights for free trial and stuff? Actually, if you look at El Salvador, Bukele came out of the party FMLN, which was the guerrillas during the civil wars, which ended back in the early 1990s. He was not, as far as I know, a guerrilla, but he came out of that party, which was hugely corrupt. And he actually left the party because the party rejected him. And then he decided, okay, I'm going to tear the whole house down. And that's what he has been doing. So yes, short-term problem. We need to get bad guys off the street. But what's really behind it? And also there's another Bukele bit of this. I don't have firsthand information. I'm a victim of lack of access, but I'm an analyst as well, and my job has always been to look at patterns and try to assign a certain amount of credibility to what's said. FMLN presidents and the other party, Arena presidents, and Bukele have all found ways to cut deals with the gangs. There's a negotiation that goes on, and that is if you reduce the murders, we'll reduce the arrests, things like that. And what they wind up doing sometimes is arresting boys, because most of these are just boys. They're arresting boys that have been fingered by competing gangs to get them off the street because they're competitors. In the bigger sense, if you really want to deal with gangs in El Salvador, you have to go back to square one. And that is the government has to reoccupy the spaces that the gangs have taken over. These gangs don't mount civil wars against local and state level. They don't use the word state, but the local and state authorities. They walk in because the state and local authorities are so corrupt or so underfunded or so vulnerable that the gangs don't have to fight. They just go in, they wind up being the local government, they wind up being the major employer in these areas, they wind up taking the sons away from the women who are working at almost slave labor, slave wage jobs and stuff, and then they take over. You want to solve the gang problem? Yes, you've got to do arrests, but you also have to give them trials, you have to give them credible things, not put them in concentration camps, and you have to address the underlying causes, the underlying drivers of the problem.
Yeah, it almost feels like when you have a leader who pushes this concept of, we need to pull back on democratic institutions. It's almost finding the lazy way out because it's easier to say that you'll solve by simply violating the principles of democratic norms than to do the hard work within the normal institutions of rebuilding and making it hard for criminals and others to operate in that space. So
Exactly.
do
Exactly. Rebuilding and rectifying, because sometimes you do have something to work with, but you don't just destroy.
Yeah, do you see that is those are the societies that are most vulnerable to these types of leaders are those where the government in its let's say some of them are more mature than others in their liberal democratic values, but let's say they were making the attempt but they simply fell short, that it's in those societies that these types of leaders gain the most traction because of a disillusionment with what they have seen to date from a more traditional definition of democracy?
In some of the ones that are, I think you used the word more mature, in the more mature democracies, no. But in the ones that are climbing out of, as in the case of Hungary, Poland had slipped quite a bit and seems now to be more on track than it was before. Those that are climbing out of historical burdens in Latin America, there's a lot of history weighing down things that are hindering institutions. And frankly, one of the problems is the the elites, the wealthy elites of these countries, have never really stepped up to be a leadership class. Some people like to use the word oligarchy. Oligarchy sounds like it's coordinated, but in much of Latin America, part of their burden is that everybody's in it for themselves. There's not really much coordination, and even in countries with that we see from outside as having relatively developed economies, the elites pay almost no taxes whatsoever. How can you have a modern country that's going to produce wealth for your elites if the elites don't pay taxes to protect the society, to grow the society, to build institutions, even to build roads and sewage and electricity for people? And so those ones, yes, you're right. The burden has been the institutions just never caught up. They weren't up for the task. And then the temptation is to do, quote, the easy thing. But we also have a phenomenon of slipping among the more developed countries that had vibrant democratic institutions and checks and balances, such as we're seeing at times in certain elections, some scary things going on that sound very illiberal in places like the Netherlands, even some parties in Germany, and certainly in France, you have this voice that keeps coming back that want to move away from the liberal democracy model, but they don't exactly say where they want to go. But as for like the United States, there's really no excuse for saying that our institutions had failed. Maybe you could say our leaders had failed to provide solutions, or you could maybe say that the feeders of American democracy, whether they be the media or the Congress, which has a disgracefully low turnover rate and stuff, maybe what they did, they missed opportunities to do what Jefferson called these rebellions, and that is to give power back to people, to real people, and really do, to steal a slogan from Barack Obama's campaign, change that we can believe in. Because in the end, with Barack Obama, it was Michelle that had more change that people wanted to believe in. And they isolated the people that could be, whether you like everything that a Bernie Sanders would say or an AOC would say, whether you like it or not, democracy requires that you have polls, that you have these two things. I don't call them extremes because we have no real extremes in the United States. Our most extreme, quote, lefty, who calls himself a socialist, is actually a minutely left of center politician in European and Asian terms and stuff. So we have to look at the whole system rather than just the leader saying, "Oh, we've got to make these changes. Let's do it the easy way."
So, when you think about what the most important elements of a liberal democracy are to defend to avoid the rapid slide into authoritarianism, we covered some of them. We talked about the critical importance of an independent and free press. We talked about the impartiality of independent courts. We talked about academia and individual free speech. There's a lot of things in there, and many of them are under attack, frankly, in both developed and developing nations. Is there any one of those in your studies of cultures, societies, governments, where when the first of those dominoes fall, it precipitates all of the others? Is there one institution that must be protected in order to protect the others?
One institution that has to be protected more than all the others, I would say, would be an institutional value. I don't mean to play with you on this, institutional value of transparency and accountability, which is usually represented by the media. The media right now have been on the run for a long time, if nothing else, because of technology, because they do have writers in the sense of people that can make clear, succinct, meaningful sentences, and they do have editors, and they do have responsibilities that the social media do not. The social media, which are driven by algorithms by and large, and they're everybody's paying everybody else to be an influencer. I mean, even those who do not call themselves influencers are indeed influencers. And even when you do your Google searches and stuff, they're compared against a profile, and there's somebody who's going to be paying these various search tools. And with AI, we're just beginning to see how massively perverting all of this can be. Those algorithms, somebody's going to pay one of these services to give you the first 10 hits that they want you to see, not really what you need to see. That's a perversion of the flow of information. The media, I've always been criticized, whether you call them the nattering nabobs of negativism back during Nixon and Agnew, or the criticism that various administrations who never really love the press, because the press are not their mouthpieces. One other reason that we have to feel sorry for the media is that our leaders now Twitter or X their information out to people directly and say, pay no attention to that little journalist behind a curtain. Listen to me. Hear it straight from my mouth and all. So that's good. But also the transparency and accountability that the United States Congress represents. When you have a Congress where both parties are getting huge campaign donations from the same claque of lobbyists, the same set of industries, you then can't wonder, you lose your right, if you're not asking that, to wonder how come we have no change, because it's all being subsidized and paid for by the same group of special interests. Then the Congress isn't doing its job. I think also the Congress has to pull back a little bit. I worked for 3 years on an oversight committee, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I was shocked about how audacious that even during a Democratic administration, they refused to do transparency on some very fundamental government programs. So the Congress then says, oh, okay, okay, because they're being offered some sort of inducement back from the administration. So the Congress should basically grow up, grow a pair, and start doing its oversight in a serious way. Stop allowing itself to be lobbied by private sector interests, but also being lobbied by government programs that take on these tremendous lives and momentum that they become unstoppable. And now I don't believe in a deep state, but I do believe that government programs gain so much momentum that the people that are responsible for their oversight in the institutions and also in Congress, as I was just saying, but in the institutions become wedded to these programs and protect them. And they become what we used to call, when I was hanging around in operational circles, self-licking ice cream cones. And that is, some congressman or some agency develops a legitimate program to try to achieve something. It's then assigned to the bureaucracy to implement. The bureaucrats, instead of doing policy, almost always prefer to do programs because it's more powerful. You're dishing out money, people are coming up and kissing your ring. The Congress, you have a built-in constituency, and you insulate yourself more and more from the question that policy agencies are supposed to be doing, and that is, are we supposed to be doing this? Is this serving the national interest? And they become then these cocoons that become unassailable. And the Congress's job is to break those cocoons down, to open those cocoons up and say, do we really need to be spending money on this again? All of this, I'm making the argument for reform, but not for breaking everything down. Yes, USAID here in the United States did need some reform. They got lost in the woods. They got involved in covert actions in foreign countries to help overthrow regimes. They get all these different programs, but by doing that, they diluted their mission and they diluted the focus of the American people, including the United States Congress, that a lot of what USAID does is really, really important stuff that gives us massive benefit. But because they become so wrapped up in their programs, they became, at least from the current administration's, the new administration's view, unreformable. So we shut them down. I think that really we need to do a lot more reform than a lot less destroy than destroying.
So let's come back to the free press element of this, because I do think that's a very, very important point about when you start to lose that, it's easier to tear everything else down, and that for a free press well run can often be the spotlight that brings transparency. In a different era, it was fairly easy for a strongman government to simply shut down media outlets, censor them out of existence, and prison journalists. And of course, that still happens today. In the modern era, with all the technology and algorithms that you just mentioned, many of these leaders seem to simply be propagandizing the space in such an effective way that they can actually allow a free press to continue, but they drown them out in an ocean of their own content. And some of it's very compelling and very convincing, so that there is the perception of a free press. There may still be a free press, but the finger is sort of on the balance in a direction towards the state media, let's call it, or state sponsored or state supported media, that it simply is overwhelming in its share of voice and therefore very convincing. Is this a Western phenomenon, or is this something that we see around the world and we've seen throughout history, regardless of the forms of communication?
You're making a very good point. Um, yes, they can sometimes just make the big media, make some people call it mainstream, corporatist media. They could basically make them irrelevant by flooding the waters with their own voices, but also remember their bases are very sophisticated, very powerful, very well funded sources of information, misinformation, and disinformation, etc. But I think also one characteristic of illiberalism is the constant repeated harangues against the media or silly games against the media that you punish reporters and make them examples of what will happen to you if you dare to cross the administration. But yes, you're completely right. Though that's a very important dynamic. It's almost universal that anybody who's in power doesn't want somebody yapping away or nipping at their ankles with critical thinking, critical thought, and heaven forbid, critical information. It's universal. So everybody tries, of both parties, tries to find ways to minimize them. I think here in Washington, where I'm sitting, Brian, this week we have a great big discussion about this new book. I think it's called Original Sin, about the cover up of the true state of President Biden's health for the last year plus of his time in office. That is a failure of them. They did the cover up, but it's a failure also of the media that did get to see things that were going on around them. And so we do need this dynamic. I think it was either Jefferson or Franklin who said, if you give me a choice between having a government and a free press, I'll take a free press because there are self-regulating dynamics. The pendulum doesn't swing so radically in the media and particularly in the print press and even in the electronic press that have websites where you can see what was on last night's broadcasts or last night's news and stuff. There's a level of accountability. We've lost the accountability. Just one last comment, and that is something that's very typical in Latin America, and I believe in Asia as well, and that is that when the leadership class, the elites, these are wealthy elites, I'm not talking about movie stars and stuff, but the wealthy elites begin to own the media, they will steer the media. And frankly, in our system, you own the paper, you own the editorial page, right? That's the way it was. The news side is usually a separate thing that the owner, the publisher will tolerate. But the editorial page really does belong to the one who keeps the lights on and stuff. We've seen in the last year two major newspapers. This is in an industry where we've lost a massive number of major newspapers and critical thinkers and strong editors and stuff that decided that they were not going to perform their traditional role in the presidential election and explicitly directed their people, thou shalt not do a candidate endorsement, even though among the staff it was. That's when you're using these wealthy businessmen to censor the professionals that work on the editorial pages, and at least then say, okay, why don't you write an essay, Mr. Publisher or Ms. Publisher, that expresses your view, but then let us write another one. When that breaks down, even the corporatist media, even these traditional titans of information, self marginalize. And you then have to wonder really what's going on here? Where's the alternative voice going to be coming from? But I agree with you 1000%. My career, as you know, was in intelligence. And in intelligence, we all had to believe it was actually the motto of the CIA: seek the truth, and the truth shall set you free. And if the media don't help us seek the truth, and if the media don't push the Congress to use their access to seek the truth, then our democracy suffers.
And it has to be an even-handed approach to be credible. Let's talk for a moment about maybe the part that we don't talk about enough when you see authoritarian style leaders come to power in whether it's illiberal democracies or outright authoritarian regimes, which is an amount of apathy that can come from the public that would have otherwise potentially stopped those leaders from getting into power in the first place. There is certainly an analysis that can be done of elections that we have seen strongman leaders come to power in democratic institutions, that the reason that they really won those elections was because of how many voters simply stayed home and stayed out of the process and tuned out. And you can argue that some of the backsliding we've seen in freedom of the press and other freedoms has been from a lack of, frankly, protest and a lack of people standing up and using their voices. So this is one of those phenomenon that could be a passing one, but in order for a liberal democracy to really stay strong, it requires the people who have those freedoms to be actively engaged in their government and their society. Do you agree that we have seen a disengagement, and do you feel it's a generational issue, Or is it a sort of malaise that, regardless of your age or background, we're all just sort of sleepwalking into these authoritarian regimes?
Excellent question. Again, the I would say the short answer is all of the above. But before we talk about sort of voting patterns and stuff, I have to share that I do have windows into university campuses. And the attacks on the universities are hurting people. The disappearance of international students or international students being having their visas taken away, these have an impact far beyond the students who are losing their visas. It has an idea of saying, frankly, whether you are of a right wing persuasion or left wing persuasion, that some rights are being taken away from you. But one really powerful phenomenon that we've seen in the last year that is discouraging, and I think it's by plan, discouraging protests, including among our most idealistic citizens, university students, and that is the phenomenon of doxing combined with facial recognition software. You know that doxing is the phenomenon in which during protests, and this is mostly on the Gaza protests and stuff, but it hasn't just been Gaza protests. There are people in the crowd taking pictures. And now, of course, universities are requiring that you can't wear COVID type masks and you have to show your whole face, et cetera, et cetera. There are people in the crowd taking pictures. Those pictures are being sent digitally to somebody who has facial recognition software. They're finding your name and they're publishing your name. I think in Harvard, remember, there were trucks driving around with big video screens showing students faces and names, and later they compiled packages to send to potential employers that these students might be applying to do. This doxing phenomenon, combined especially with the facial recognition software, is having a massive impact on people's willingness to stand up, especially at a time when the economy is looking a little bit shaky, not just because of tariffs and stuff, but because the fundamentals of the economy are in a moment of transition. If students don't feel like they can go to class, that they can participate in protests, that they can write op-eds for the student newspaper, like the woman at Tufts University had done and stuff, that has a huge dampening, chilling effect on the quality of debate, not just on university campuses, but outside. As for voting trends, I think I'm not a specialist. You know that I'm not a specialist in these things, so I say it with humility. But the absence of blocks of voters in last year's elections here in the United States did show that something's wrong. Because let's use Democratic Party terms, okay? Democratic Party terms is, let's just say that Donald Trump is a threat to African Americans' interests. But where were the African American men? Why didn't they turn out? Was it just because African American men have a little problem voting for African American women? Or was it just utter disenchantment, a pox on both their houses? I don't know the answer, but I think that the low turnout among certain groups and the low turnout among, for example, Latinos, or even more, the shift of Latinos from one party to the other are huge. Didn't they know that at some point these deportations were going to hurt them? Didn't they know that it was going to change American culture gradually from one of acceptance and embrace and really true love for them, and the amazing contribution that immigrants make to the U.S. economy and to our culture, frankly? Didn't they know that eventually that this cultural shift was going to hurt them and have them be looked at a little bit as a lower status? I don't know. But the thing here is that problems are complex. And when problems are complex and there's a lot of name calling going on and a lot of blaming going on and a lot of manipulative information, and I'm not just talking about from the leader of one party or the other, when the waters are so muddied, people don't know what to do and they stay home.
I think one of the biggest fears that those who are defenders of liberal democracies have is how hard it is to build a sustainable one and how easy it can be to tear it down. And once torn down, how hard it can be to rebuild. So, In the societies, the countries around the world that have seen this rising illiberalism, what do you believe is the outlook for fighting back against it? And do you believe that we are now on a trend towards these more authoritarian styles of government that is going to play out over a longer period of time? And we may see more backsliding before we see some fighting back.
The answer to your second question is I think there will be more backsliding because what we're seeing here is not just a short-term reaction to a crisis. And a crisis means I'm going to go back into my shell, and maybe my political behavior will become a little bit more erratic. I think what we're seeing is something that's much more gradual, some of it intention, some of it by plan. One could argue that some of this is planned, but these undermining of our culture of tolerance, our culture of accountability, our culture of transparency, and our culture of understanding that, yeah, institutions can be pains in the ass, but we need them. We need them. We need them to protect us. We need them to protect us from certain business practices. We need them to protect us from food additives. We need government protection. We need institutions, and we need a free press. Yeah, I don't like everything that's in the newspaper. Most people don't even read the newspapers, and actually the most severe critics of the newspapers don't read newspapers. The most severe critics of the corporatist media do not read the corporatist media. They're just bandwagoning because they're pissed off. Someone has instilled for them, in the face of real problems and real need for reform, someone has channeled that into an immense amount of fear, an immense amount of manipulation, and an immensely gratifying feeling of having somebody to blame. Let's blame somebody. If we can't blame my next door neighbor, let's blame the immigrants. If we can't blame the immigrants, let's blame the Chinese. Let's blame the Mexicans. Let's blame the Russians. Blame, blame, blame. So you have the seed of a legitimate problem, which you could then say, what's the mature thing to do? I said earlier, analysis, options, decision, debate, and decisions. But instead, what you do is you touch the third rail by playing it all as fear. Yes, life is about fear. A lot of life is about fear. There's joy, there's a lot of joy, but it's also about fear. And then what you do is you manipulate to create the fear and to deepen the fear, and you steer it then toward the blame game. And strong men love to do that. Strong men need an enemy. They always do, because their own legitimacy doesn't come from the support. They need to have fear. And I think if we go back to, I don't know where you went to grade school, but I went to grade school in a Stamford, Connecticut, and there were the bullies on the play lot. And the bully would use fear, and more people followed the bully out of fear for the bully and fear for the world that the bully said that they were defending against, than the really thoughtful classmates, boys or girls, that would say, well, wait, no, it's really not that bad. We can solve these problems. As you said a few moments ago, it's easy to rally people around something negative. It's very hard to rally people around something that's positive and takes time.
One of the areas of the world, obviously, that you have a tremendous expertise is Latin America. What can Latin America teach us about fighting back against these sorts of trends of illiberalism and authoritarianism?
Latin America is a great, it's a petri dish for how to do and not to do governance. And unfortunately, we're one of the bacteria growing in that petri dish, because when they do start doing things among themselves, and that unity in some way or other will threaten our interests, the US interests, we'll find a rather clever way to break that unity, because their elites are still the same elites that had been thriving under the Spanish crown back until the 1820s, 1830s. We came in, we called it the Monroe Doctrine, and we had our reasons, to keep the French and the British and everybody else out of, quote, our backyard and stuff. But it was even more clever that what we did is we kept them subordinated, not necessarily subjugated, but subordinated to us and eager to please us. And it's worked. for a zillion years. We've been doing this. So the elites, instead of, as I said earlier, instead of paying their local taxes, they put their money up in American banks, in U.S. banks. They, instead of responding to their neighbors and understanding their own citizenship, they spend their time trying to convince us of how great they are, and it works. It really works. So we right now have in Latin America the wave. There's a pendulum in Latin America that you go toward. Let's use the words left and right. The pendulum swings over to the left. The left has fails because they don't really have legitimate models, and so the pendulum swings back over to the right, promising, to use parlance of our strongman analogy, that they'll at least make the trains run on time. But they can't make the trains run on time because they don't have any tax dollars. They don't have anything to do it. They don't invest in their own economies. They want the Chinese to come and build their infrastructure. They wanted us to do it, but we said, no, we're not going to do it. And now the Chinese are going and building their infrastructure. But later on, the people will find out, nope, they can't even make the trains run on time. And the pendulum will swing back and forth. Right now, geographically, let's say Mexico, which is an extraordinary exception right now because Claudia Sheinbaum is so far been genius at doing both domestic and international policy. But Central America, it's lost. It's completely lost. Except, Bukele is the fair-haired boy of the U.S. government, and it didn't just begin under Trump. The Biden people also gave him a lot of space for everything that he was doing and stuff. But you then keep going. Nicaragua's a disaster. Costa Rica is headed downward. It's a neat country with neat people. Panama looks like it's headed downward. Colombia, the president has really not got much traction. It looks like it's going to swing back over to the right. Ecuador is already on the right, and it looks like it's going to go more Bukele right. Peru has been a right-wing, somewhat illegitimate president. No progress. Keep going down there. You have a lefty in Boric in Chile, who lost huge historic opportunities to do a rewrite of the Constitution. Had a massive consensus to fix the Constitution, but he was unable to make it happen. Milei, the guy in Argentina, responding to Argentine DNA as much as anything else, is sort of semi-wacky, but he calls himself the Trump of South America. But I don't think even Trump has done some things that Milei has done. Then you have, moving up, you have Uruguay, Paraguay, stuff. You have Brazil with a very much more mature, former lefty, now sort of center-left Lula, but who's not doing much. And Venezuela up there on the top, being the disaster of South America, but it's also a U.S. foreign policy disaster. So what's the state of democracy in Latin America? Highly illiberal and probably headed towards significantly worse because we have been the shining light on the hill. The United States of America, the shining light on the hill. We have also been the taskmasters who said to them, thou shalt not violate human rights. Thou shalt not do this. You shalt not encourage corruption. You shalt not, you shalt not, you shalt not. And then they look at us and they say, you hypocrites, look at you. And you want us to do it? No, thank you. Not going to happen.
If not the United States, given the political realities in that country today, is there another shining light in the world that can be looked to for the nations of the world that still aspire to a liberal democracy? The U.S. has always been the beacon, the example that is looked to. Well, not always, but I mean, in our lifetime.
Yeah.
If not the U.S., is there another that could take the U.S.'s place, or at least stand in its place during this period of transition?
I don't see it. I don't see another thing because we were the United States of America. And from sea to shining sea, we're also incredibly wealthy. The way we had done our history, the way we had done our model, the way we took charge of the world economy after World War II, the way, remember Tony Blinken, Secretary of State Tony Blinken would say the rules-based international order, which was in desperate need for renovation and reform. We clung to that rules-based international order, which served our purposes so long that we've lost it. We lost that consensus. The model is broken, and there's no one else that has a model. So I think, and this isn't necessarily bad for the development of regions like Latin America, they're going to pick and choose. They're going to say, all right, the Chinese do some stuff pretty well. Actually, we Americans don't like to acknowledge it, but China has done surprisingly well. When we opened the doors to China way back in the 1970s, I was actually living in Asia at the time. Many of our top policy people thought we can open the door because they pose no competitive threat, much less an existential threat. No competitive threat. Eh? But the Chinese stopped doing their great leaps forward, their cultural revolutions, all of these self inflicted wounds. They got a thing called discipline. They also found a model that, yes, human rights are a serious problem, but the country did move forward and they pulled more tens of millions of people out of poverty than any other country has done in world history. But so the model needed to change. And the Latin Americans are saying, some of what they do isn't all that bad. But they're also looking at the EU, and they really admire the EU because of its reach, its deep cultural roots, its stability, etc. I think also they resent the Latin Americans resent that the U.S., particularly under the current administration, has increasingly been anti-EU, and they'll say, well, but you know something, Spain, La Madre Patria for much of Latin America, and even Portugal, who do actually inspired migration strategies and stuff, they're pretty good. And Greece and Italy, all the Mediterranean countries, and then the upper tier, they like them. They're effective. I don't think they feel they're warm and cuddly, but so I think that for Latin Americans, they're going to play a la carte, partly for personal advantage, but also because there is no single model that they think that they can embrace and make their own.
While the discussion today has been focused on liberal and illiberal democracies, and we've covered a lot of that ground, I would be remiss, given your expertise in the region, to not, and my listeners would be mad at me if I didn't at least ask the tariff question about Latin America in particular. And specifically, what I wanted to ask you, given your expertise, is that some noted that for all of the wild sort of tariff numbers that were thrown out by the U.S. administration during quote unquote Liberation Day, Latin America, with the exception of Mexico, seemed to be on the receiving end of more favorable numbers, given what Trump threw out to the world. And some read into that it was sort of a tacit push towards businesses that if you're going to do offshoring, you should do it in this hemisphere, and perhaps there should be some benefit to doing it among the countries of Latin America. I'm curious how you read that and how you're reading this administration's both public statements and maybe their more subtle statements about their view of the Western Hemisphere and specifically Latin American countries beyond Mexico.
The interpretation of the tariffs issue has been lost in the overall dark signals given to Latin America on the deportations and migration issue. I think one could argue that the administration didn't go, to slash Latin America up to little bits on the tariffs thing because Latin America doesn't pose a threat. But it could also be an element of goodwill, perhaps maybe even influenced by the Secretary of State, an ounce of goodwill to let's not cause them more harm and all that. The problem is that we don't have a strategy for dealing with the contradiction in our policy that we're not going to punish them, but we're not giving them either an alternative to come to daddy instead of to China. And I think it's because the Chinese packages right now are much more attractive than anything that we would do. I think also Latin America felt a little bit bent out of shape because of the way USAID was chopped up or eliminated. Because even though they're not huge aid recipients and stuff, they sort of want to realize they want the United States to show recognition that there are lesser endowed, less there are poorer countries in the world that do need some help. But the deportations thing, I think, has caused the administration, whatever positive messages on the tariffs is lost in the negative message of deportation, especially the treatment of Venezuelans being sent to concentration camps in El Salvador. For Latin Americans, that's a very scary prospect because they want to come to the United States. They also want to work their asses off when they're up here, and they do work their asses off. And this is what we do to them: send them back to Bukele. So I think that that's unfortunately the major message that they're getting from the United States of America.
And I'll conclude on we haven't had a chance to talk about the administration's very early blusterous comments on Panama, the Panama Canal, and a very confrontational set of exchanges that really harkened back to the worst era of U.S. imperialism in the region. That has largely faded from the headlines as we record in May of 2025. How much damage did that do to U.S. credibility in the region?
I think you're right. Thank you for praising that, because it did do a lot of damage. I think, though, that some of the damage was mitigated by the ludicrous assertions that we were going to also take over Canada, Greenland, and there was one other place that we were going to take over. I forget. But they say, well, at least we're in good company. And because, Latin Americans don't want to be singled out as the littlest of little brothers. And so when you then say, well, no, we're going to take Canada and Greenland too, I think that led to some good laughs and made them realize that this isn't a serious policy.
Well, as always, we've covered a lot of ground. Thank you so much for taking time to walk us through some very complicated topics. If folks would like to follow your work and your thoughts, is there any place for them to do so?
No, I don't do social media. I read the newspapers, but thank you very much for welcome. They can find me at American University, american.edu if they'd like.
Very well. Well, we'll have them keep coming back to our program to hear your thoughts then.
Thanks very much.
Fulton, thank you so much again for joining us, and we look forward to having you back, whatever happens in the next chapter of geopolitics.
We'll see. Thanks, Brian.
It might be harder than you think to find the alternative side of the conversation we just had, but we're determined to do so. And this season, we're going to search high and low for defenders of what would be called illiberal democracies, because there are multiple conversations happening around the world within different societies about the merits of traditional liberal democratic values. You're not going to find too many academics, because of course it would be a dangerous world to live in for an academic to not have academic freedom. You're not going to find a ton of people in the media, certainly. In other words, you're not going to find a ton of people who do shows like this and who would appear on shows like this to be defending the idea that we shouldn't be doing shows like this, that we shouldn't be having open, free, fair conversations. But we know there are plenty of backers of some of these political movements around the world, and others in more conservative parts of societies that simply feel like liberal democratic institutions have not served them well, have left them behind, have not upheld their end of democratic bargains, and so therefore need to be reformed and potentially reined in. And we're going to look for those guests to provide you, that balanced perspective. We had a conversation today with somebody who's, I think, truly a defender of the most elemental elements of liberal democracy. But there are those who truly do have serious questions and skepticism about liberal democracy, those values, those institutions. And it's not necessarily that they don't want to see freedom of the press or free speech, or that they don't want to see freedom of courts. It's just they believe that those institutions have been corrupted in a way that now need to be reined in. And I think that is a perspective worthy of exploring. And I look forward to doing so as we look for guests who can come on and bring some of that perspective to our audience. We want to be as balanced as we can in these. As we wrap the show today, I do simply want to offer one thing that we didn't get to specifically with Fulton, but is an area that I'm looking out for, which is we've already established that many democratic countries in the world, places where there are free and fair elections, have chosen to move in a direction of strongman leaders that are, in some cases, very flagrantly rolling back freedoms of the press. They are infringing upon the independence of courts. They are infringing upon the freedoms of universities and academic institutions, and they are making free speech difficult for their political opponents and adversaries. But what we didn't talk about is one of the natural outcomes of a more centralized government with less transparency, with less freedom for individual expression, and with a weakened rule of law. And that is overwhelming corruption, blatant, in-your-face, pay-to-play corruption, which can happen anywhere in the world, even in the most advanced liberal democracies, and of course it does. But the kind of corruption that allows small numbers of individuals to exert outsized control over the levers of economic output that allow them to maintain their place in society without adding additional value, and critically, while crushing competitors who would otherwise be innovating and pushing society forward through competition. This is a cost of illiberal systems that I don't think can be underestimated, and I would encourage our global audience to take into consideration as you look at different political movements. The reason that freedom is so valuable and so important for expression and for exploration is because it leads to innovation. And it is innovation and competition that can lead to a better life for everybody because of the discoveries that come through entrepreneurship, through academic exploration, and through challenging the status quo. Perhaps the worst thing about an illiberal democracy, or at least the danger that even proponents acknowledge exists, is that a small group of individuals seizes the majority of power in a way that crushes innovation and competition, that hardens the rules in their favor to enrich themselves, despite the fact that they add diminishing levels of value, holding everybody back. And this potentially is a danger that doesn't get talked about enough in the context of the value of democracies, or at least the value of free and fair election democracies. But it is one of the consequences that affects people the absolute most. Because it's bad enough not to be able to have a conversation in public. It's bad enough not to know that there's an impartial judge that will hear your case and that can appeal your legal situation. It's bad enough not to have the spotlights of a free and fair press. But to not have the benefits of a modern society because innovation has been pummeled and because a small number of very powerful elites are maintaining power simply for maintenance sake, not because they've brought any new value to the market, that is a consequence, a second-tier consequence that can affect everyone's quality of life in future generations. I thank you for listening to my perspective on this and for listening to the entire conversation. If you'd like to hear more conversations like this, all you have to do is subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts to the Brian J. Matos Show, where we bring you the smartest minds on the most important topics that are happening around the world and that affect all of us now and in the future. Thank you all again for listening. Look forward to talking to you again in a future episode. And until we talk again, I hope you will all stay curious.